The story of Máel Sechnaill Domnaill begins not with the clash of swords at Tara, but in the halls of power, where a young prince learned what it meant to rule a fractured land. Picture Ireland in the middle of the 10th century after Christ. This wasn't the unified nation we know today, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each with its own king, its own ambitions, and its own grudges. The Vikings had been raiding and settling for over a century, carving out their own territories and making Dublin their stronghold. Into this chaotic world was born Máel Sechnaill in 949. His very name tells us something important. Máel Sechnaill means devotee of Saint Secundinus, showing how deeply Christian faith had taken root in Ireland. But this was no gentle monk prince. He was born into the southern Nail dynasty, a family that had tasted supreme power before. His grandfather, Domnaill, had worn the crown of High King, and young Máel Sechnaill grew up hearing tales of that golden time when one man could truly claim to rule all of Ireland. But those days seemed long gone. The Nail controlled Mide, the central kingdom, but their authority barely extended beyond its borders. To the south, the kings of Munster were growing stronger, particularly a rising star named Brian Boru. To the east, the Vikings of Dublin commanded trade routes and raided at will. To the north and west, other Irish kings pursued their own ambitions, paying lip service to the idea of a high king but following no one's lead. Imagine what it must have been like for young Máel Sechnaill, standing on the hill of Tara where his ancestors had been crowned. The ancient seat of the High King still held its mystical power, but it must have felt hollow, like a crown without a kingdom. The boy who would become known as Máel Sechnaill the Great was learning hard lessons about power. It wasn't enough to inherit it. You had to take it, hold it, and prove you deserved it every single day. As he came of age, Máel Sechnaill watched the political chess game playing out across Ireland. The Vikings weren't just raiders anymore. They had become part of the Irish political landscape, intermarrying with Irish nobles, adopting some Irish customs while keeping their own fierce warrior culture. Olaf Cuaran, the King of Dublin, was perhaps the most powerful of these Norse-Irish rulers. He commanded respect through fear, and his influence stretched far beyond the walls of Dublin. This was the world that shaped Máel Sechnaill. He learned to read the subtle signs of shifting alliances, to know when to fight and when to negotiate, when to trust and when to strike first. He was being forged in the crucible of Irish politics, where survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead, and where a single mistake could mean death or exile. When Máel Sechnaill finally claimed his father's throne as King of Mide, he inherited more than just a kingdom. He inherited a legacy of greatness and the crushing weight of expectation. The question that haunted him, and that would drive everything he did, was simple yet profound. Could the ancient glory of Gaelic Ireland be restored? Or was he watching the sunset of his people's independence? The young king looked out over his realm and saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. The very fractures that weakened Ireland also created possibilities for a clever, ruthless, and determined ruler. But first, he would need to deal with the most immediate threat to Irish sovereignty. The Viking king in Dublin had grown too powerful, too confident. It was time to remind Olaf Cuaran that this was still Gaelic land. What Máel Sechnaill was planning would either make him a legend or destroy him completely. The stage was set for one of the most crucial battles in Irish history, a confrontation that would echo through the centuries and determine whether Ireland's future belonged to the Gaelic kings or the Viking lords. The making of a king begins long before the crown touches his head, and for Máel Sechnaill, that education started in the shadow of giants. Picture the Great Hall of Mide in the late 10th century after Christ. The young prince would have sat by flickering firelight, listening to the bards recite the deeds of his ancestors. These weren't just stories, they were blueprints for greatness, maps of how power could be won and lost. His grandfather Domnaill hadn't just been a king among kings, he had been the High King, the one man in all of Ireland who could summon the other rulers to his banner. But that was a generation ago. And power in Ireland was like quicksilver, beautiful, valuable, and impossible to hold on to. The southern Nail dynasty that Máel Sechnaill belonged to had ruled the Kingdom of Mide for centuries. Mide wasn't just any kingdom. It sat right in the heart of Ireland, controlling the vital crossroads where merchants, warriors, and messengers traveled between north and south, east and west. From Mide, you could theoretically reach any corner of Ireland within a few days' hard riding. But theory and reality were two different things in 10th century Ireland. What made young Máel Sechnaill's situation even more complex was that he was growing up during what we might call Ireland's Great Transition. The old order was crumbling, but nothing clear had emerged to replace it. The title of High King still existed, but it had become almost ceremonial. Real power lay with whoever could gather the most warriors, control the most territory, and strike the most advantageous deals. And then, there were the stories about Brian Boru. Even as a young man, Máel Sechnaill would have heard whispers about this remarkable king rising in Munster. Brian wasn't from one of the traditional High King families. He was essentially an upstart, a brilliant military commander who was rewriting the rules of Irish politics through sheer force of will and tactical genius. Some of the older nobles probably dismissed Brian as a flash in the pan, but Máel Sechnaill was smart enough to recognize a game-changer when he heard about one. Here's what made Brian's rise so threatening and so inspiring at the same time. He wasn't content to be just another regional king squabbling over cattle raids and marriage alliances. Brian had a vision of what Ireland could become, and he was methodically making that vision reality. He was defeating the Vikings not just in single battles, but systematically dismantling their power across Munster. He was forging alliances that actually held together. Most importantly, he was proving that the High Kingship didn't have to be just an empty title. For Máel Sechnaill, watching Brian's meteoric rise must have been both inspiring and deeply unsettling. Here was proof that greatness was still possible, that one man really could unite Ireland's fractured kingdoms. But Brian's success also meant that if Máel Sechnaill wanted to restore his family's ancient glory, he was going to have to compete with perhaps the most formidable Irish king in living memory. The Viking threat added another layer of complexity to everything. By Máel Sechnaill's time, the Norse settlers weren't just foreign invaders anymore. They had been in Ireland for over a century, long enough to put down roots, learn the language, and become part of the political landscape. Many had intermarried with Irish nobles. Some had converted to Christianity, but they still maintained their fierce warrior culture and their loyalty to kings like Olaf Cuaran in Dublin. This created an almost impossible puzzle for any ambitious Irish king. The Vikings were clearly a threat to Gaelic independence, but they were also potentially valuable allies. They controlled key ports and trade routes. They had wealth from commerce and plunder, and they were superb fighters when properly motivated. The question was whether to fight them, recruit them, or try to somehow do both. Now picture Máel Sechnaill in his early 20s, standing on the hill of Tara, as the document suggests. This wasn't just any hill. It was the most sacred site in all of Ireland, the place where high kings had been crowned since time immemorial. The ancient stones still stood there, weathered by centuries but still radiating power and mystery. On a clear day, you could see for miles in every direction, across the green fields and dark forests that made up the heart of Ireland. What was going through his mind as he stood there? He would have known that his grandfather had stood on this same hill, accepting the submission of lesser kings and promising to protect Ireland from all enemies. But he would also have known how empty that promise had become. Ireland wasn't protected. It was divided, vulnerable, and slipping away from Gaelic control piece by piece. Did he feel the weight of destiny pressing down on him? Almost certainly. The bards had been filling his head with tales of heroic kings since he was old enough to understand words. He carried the blood of high kings, and in a culture that believed deeply in the power of ancestry, that wasn't just symbolic. It was a genuine source of both strength and obligation. But he must have felt doubt too. He was young, untested in battle, and facing challenges that would have daunted men twice his age and experience. Brian Boru was already reshaping the South. The Vikings controlled the richest city in Ireland. His own authority barely extended beyond the borders of Mide. How could one young king, no matter how noble his bloodline, possibly hope to restore the ancient glory of Gaelic Ireland? The answer, as he was beginning to understand, lay not in dreaming about the past, but in seizing the opportunities of the present. Standing on that hill, Looking out over a divided land, Máel Sechnaill was making the calculations that would define the rest of his life. He was choosing not just to dream of greatness, but to reach for it with both hands, no matter the cost. By 980 after Christ, the situation had reached a breaking point. Olaf Cuaran wasn't just another Viking raider anymore. He had become something far more dangerous. He was a king who understood Irish politics as well as any Gaelic nobleman, and he was using that knowledge to reshape the balance of power across the island. Think about what made Olaf so formidable. He had ruled Dublin for decades, turning it from a simple Viking stronghold into the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city in Ireland. Dublin controlled the eastern seaboard, the gateway to the Irish Sea, and beyond to the broader Viking world. Ships arrived there carrying silver from distant lands, weapons forged by master smiths, and warriors seeking fortune and glory. But Olaf's true genius lay in how he had woven himself into the fabric of Irish society. He had married into Irish nobility. His children were half Irish, raised speaking both Norse and Gaelic. He had formed alliances with Irish kings who found it more profitable to work with him than against him. Some historians believe he even sponsored Irish monasteries, understanding that in a deeply Christian land, religious patronage was a path to legitimacy. This wasn't a foreign invader anymore. This was a man who had made himself indispensable to Ireland's political system. And that's exactly what made him so dangerous to someone like Máel Sechnaill. By 980, Olaf's influence stretched far beyond Dublin's walls. His warriors didn't just raid. They intervened in Irish conflicts, often deciding which side would win. His wealth bought him allies across the island. His strategic position meant that any Irish king with ambitions had to either work with him or around him. For Máel Sechnaill, watching from Mide, it must have become clear that Olaf wasn't just a threat to Gaelic independence. He was actively preventing it. But here's what makes Máel Sechnaill's decision to challenge Olaf so remarkable. This wasn't just about military strength. Olaf had been building his power for decades. He had experienced warriors, strong fortifications, and a network of allies across Ireland and beyond. Máel Sechnaill was relatively young, ruling a kingdom that, while central and important, wasn't wealthy like Dublin, or battle-hardened like some of the northern territories. What Máel Sechnaill had was something more subtle but equally powerful: legitimacy and timing. He was the rightful heir to the high kingship by blood and tradition. More importantly, he seems to have recognized that there was a growing resentment among the Irish kingdoms about Olaf's increasing dominance. The Viking king had become too successful for his own good, and that success was creating opportunities for someone clever enough to exploit them. The gathering of the Irish army for what would become the Battle of Tara was itself a masterpiece of medieval diplomacy. Máel Sechnaill didn't just march out with his own warriors from Mide. He managed to convince kings and chieftains from across Ireland to join him. Think about what that meant. These were men who had been fighting each other for generations, putting aside their feuds to face a common enemy. Some probably came because they genuinely believed in the cause of Gaelic independence. Others likely joined because they saw which way the wind was blowing and wanted to be on the winning side. The choice of Tara as the battlefield was brilliant psychological warfare. This wasn't just any patch of Irish countryside. This was the most sacred site in Gaelic Ireland, the place where high kings had been crowned since ancient times. By forcing the battle to take place there, Máel Sechnaill was making a statement that went far beyond military strategy. He was saying that this fight was about the very soul of Ireland, about whether the ancient Gaelic traditions would survive or be swept away by foreign influence. For Olaf, accepting battle at Tara was probably a strategic mistake, but one he couldn't avoid. To refuse would have looked like weakness, and in a warrior culture, the appearance of weakness could be fatal. He had to know that fighting on such symbolically important ground gave his enemies an advantage. But his own pride and the expectations of his followers left him no choice. The battle itself was a clash between two very different military traditions. The Vikings were famous for their shield wall tactics, disciplined formations of warriors with interlocking shields and long spears, designed to break enemy charges and create opportunities for devastating counterattacks. When properly executed, a Viking shield wall was nearly impregnable. The warriors were trained from childhood to fight as a unit, each man depending on his neighbors for protection and support. The Irish fighting style was traditionally more fluid, based on individual heroics and the fierce charges of warrior aristocrats. But Máel Sechnaill seems to have learned from previous defeats. Instead of simply hurling his forces against the Norse formation, he waited for the right moment to strike. Picture the scene as the two armies faced each other across the fields of Tara. The Viking shield wall would have looked terrifying. Hundreds of warriors in disciplined ranks, their shields painted with fierce designs, their spears glinting in the sunlight. Behind them, Olaf himself would have stood in his war gear, the rings on his arms and the gold in his hair marking him as a king among warriors. The Irish forces were probably more colorful but less uniform. Different clans with their own banners, their own fighting styles, their own ideas about how the battle should be fought. Máel Sechnaill challenge was to weld these diverse groups into something that could break the Viking discipline. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but the outcome was clear. Somehow, Máel Sechnaill forces found or created a gap in the Norse shield wall. Maybe it was a carefully planned maneuver, with some warriors creating a diversion, while others struck at a weak point. Maybe it was a moment of battlefield inspiration, where a quick-thinking commander saw an opportunity and seized it. Maybe it was simply the kind of chance that decides battles. A warrior stumbling at the crucial moment, a spear breaking at the wrong time, a horse shying away from the clash of weapons. Whatever the cause, once the shield wall was broken, the battle turned into a rout. The Vikings' greatest strength was their discipline and organization. Once that was shattered, they became individual warriors fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Olaf himself, the great king who had dominated Irish politics for decades, was forced to flee the field, his dreams of Norse supremacy in Ireland dying among the sacred stones of Tara. The aftermath of the battle was even more significant than the fighting itself. Dublin, the great Viking stronghold, surrendered without a siege. For the first time in over a century, the wealthiest and most strategic city in Ireland was under Gaelic control. Máel Sechnaill had done more than win a battle. He had fundamentally altered the balance of power across the island. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. The myth of Viking invincibility was broken. Irish kings who had spent their lives accepting Norse dominance suddenly saw that it was possible to fight back and win. The victory at Tara didn't just change who controlled Dublin. It changed how every ruler in Ireland thought about what was possible. For Máel Sechnaill personally, the victory was transformative. He had gone from being just another regional king to the man who had humbled the mighty Olaf Cuaran. The path to the high kingship, which had seemed so distant when he stood on the hill of Tara as a young man, was now wide open before him. The victory at Tara should have been the end of the story. Máel Sechnaill had done what seemed impossible. He had broken Viking power in Ireland and claimed the high kingship that was his birthright. For a brief, shining moment, it must have felt like the ancient glory of Gaelic Ireland had been restored. But history has a way of creating new challenges just when you think you've solved the old ones. Brian Boru had been watching everything unfold from his stronghold in Munster, and he was not impressed. Here's what made Brian so formidable, and so different from every other Irish king of his time. While others were content to rule their traditional territories and raid their neighbors, Brian was thinking on a completely different scale. He had spent decades systematically conquering and unifying the southern kingdoms, not just through force, but through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and what we might call medieval public relations. Brian understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. The old system of dozens of petty kings constantly fighting each other wasn't just inefficient, it was a recipe for foreign domination. While the Irish kingdoms exhausted themselves in endless feuds, outside powers like the Vikings could pick them off one by one or play them against each other. Brian's vision was radical for its time. He wanted to create a truly unified Ireland under a single, undisputed ruler. And that ruler, in his mind, was obviously going to be Brian Boru. Think about the personality clash between these two extraordinary men. Máel Sechnaill represented the old order at its best. Noble blood, traditional legitimacy, and the kind of heroic leadership that belonged in the ancient songs. He had earned his crown through a single decisive victory that captured the imagination of all Ireland. His claim to the high kingship was based on ancestry, law, and the dramatic triumph at Tara. Brian, on the other hand, was the ultimate self-made king. He came from a relatively minor branch of a Munster dynasty, but he had built his power through sheer force of will and an almost modern understanding of how to wage systematic warfare. He didn't just win battles, he conquered territories, absorbed defeated enemies into his own forces, and built a military machine that grew stronger with every victory. The rivalry that developed between them was unlike anything Ireland had seen before. This wasn't just two kings fighting over cattle or territory. This was a clash between two completely different visions of what Ireland could become, and both men were too intelligent and too proud to simply back down. What made their relationship so complex was that they actually needed each other. Máel Sechnaill controlled the center of Ireland and had the symbolic legitimacy of the ancient high kingship. Brian controlled the wealthy southern kingdoms and had the most effective military force in the country. Neither could afford to ignore the other, but neither could afford to appear weak. So began one of the most intricate political dances in medieval history. Sometimes they were allies, joining forces against common enemies like the remaining Viking strongholds or rebellious northern kings. Their armies fought side by side in campaigns that extended Gaelic control across Ireland. They exchanged gifts, negotiated marriage alliances between their families, and presented a united front to the outside world. But underneath the diplomatic pleasantries, they were constantly maneuvering for advantage. Every alliance was temporary. Every agreement contained the seeds of future conflict. Both men were playing a game where the ultimate prize was nothing less than the soul of Ireland. The marriage alliances were particularly fascinating. In medieval Ireland, royal marriages weren't just personal relationships. They were political treaties written in flesh and blood. When Brian married one of his daughters to one of Máel Sechnaill's sons, or when Máel Sechnaill arranged for his sister to marry one of Brian's allies, they were creating bonds that could either strengthen their alliance or provide new opportunities for betrayal. Here's what made these arrangements so volatile. Both kings were too smart to trust each other completely, but too pragmatic to ignore the benefits of cooperation. A marriage alliance might keep the peace for a few years, but it also gave each side hostages and potential claims on the other's territory. The children of these political marriages grew up knowing that their personal happiness was secondary to the great game their fathers were playing. The military campaigns of this period read like a chess match played with armies. Brian would move against a rebellious kingdom in the southwest, and Máel Sechnaill would have to decide whether to support him, oppose him, or use the distraction to advance his own interests elsewhere. Máel Sechnaill would march north to deal with troublesome Viking settlements, and Brian would calculate whether this was an opportunity to expand southward or a genuine threat that required his assistance. Both men were masters of what medieval chroniclers called the art of war without battles, the ability to achieve political objectives through the threat of force rather than actual combat. They understood that every battle was a risk, not just of military defeat, but of the kind of catastrophic loss that could destroy a kingdom overnight. Better to win through intimidation, bribery, and clever alliances than to gamble everything on the outcome of a single fight. But the most dramatic moment in their relationship came in the year 1002 after Christ, when Máel Sechnaill made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He voluntarily gave up the high kingship and acknowledged Brian Boru as his superior. Try to imagine what this meant to a man like Máel Sechnaill. He had spent his entire life working toward this moment of supreme power. He was the rightful heir by blood and tradition. He had won the crown through his own courage and military skill. The high kingship wasn't just a political position to him. It was his destiny, his family's ancient heritage, the fulfillment of everything he had been raised to believe about himself. And yet he walked away from it. The question that has fascinated historians for centuries is simple. Why? Was this a moment of weakness when Máel Sechnaill finally accepted that Brian's military superiority made further resistance pointless? Was it a tactical retreat, a temporary surrender that would allow him to rebuild his strength for a future challenge? Or was it something more complex, a recognition that Ireland's survival required unity, even if that meant sacrificing his own ambitions. Some contemporary sources suggest that Máel Sechnaill was facing pressure from multiple directions. Brian's forces were growing stronger every year, but there were also renewed Viking threats from overseas, rebellious northern kingdoms that refused to accept either claimant to the high kingship, and signs that the political unity he had worked so hard to build was beginning to fracture. Others argue that Máel Sechnaill was playing a longer game. By yielding gracefully to Brian, he avoided a potentially catastrophic civil war and preserved his own strength for future opportunities. In medieval politics, today's surrender could become tomorrow's comeback if you were patient and clever enough to wait for circumstances to change. There's also the possibility that Máel Sechnaill genuinely believed that Brian was the better choice for Ireland's future. This would have been an extraordinarily difficult admission for a proud king to make, but both men were intelligent enough to recognize each other's strengths. Maybe Máel Sechnaill looked at Brian's string of victories, his ability to inspire loyalty in former enemies, and his vision of a unified Ireland, and concluded that the country's needs were more important than his own pride. Whatever his reasons, the decision transformed Irish politics overnight. Brian Boru became the undisputed High King, and Máel Sechnaill became his most important subordinate ally. But anyone who thought this meant the end of their rivalry was badly mistaken. The game had simply moved to a new level, with new rules and new stakes. The relationship between the two kings during Brian's reign was a masterclass in managing complex political relationships. They maintained the appearance of perfect cooperation, while both sides continued to maneuver for advantage. Máel Sechnaill kept his own military forces and his independent power base in Mide. Brian treated him with the respect due to a fellow king while making sure everyone understood who held ultimate authority. But beneath the surface, both men were waiting. Brian was waiting for Máel Sechnaill to make a mistake that would justify removing him as a potential threat. Máel Sechnaill was waiting for Brian to overreach himself or face a crisis that would create opportunities for a comeback. Neither of them could have predicted that the resolution of their rivalry would come not through their own actions, but through the arrival of a new Viking threat that would change everything once again. The great game between Máel Sechnaill and Brian Boru was about to face its ultimate test. The news reached Máel Sechnaill like a thunderbolt on a clear day. Brian Boru, the man who had overshadowed him for decades, was dead on the battlefield at Clontarf. The great king who had seemed invincible, who had united Ireland under his banner and driven back the Viking threat, had fallen at the moment of his greatest triumph. It was the 23rd of April, 1014 after Christ, and the political landscape of Ireland had just been shattered completely. Think about what this moment meant for Máel Sechnaill. For 12 years he had lived in Brian's shadow, acknowledged as a great king in his own right, but always secondary to the man from Munster. He had watched Brian achieve everything he himself had dreamed of: true unity under Irish rule, the final defeat of Viking power, the creation of something that looked like a genuine Irish nation. And now, suddenly, Brian was gone, and the high kingship was vacant once again. At 65 years old, Máel Sechnaill found himself facing an opportunity he probably thought had passed him by forever. But this wasn't the same Ireland he had ruled before, and he wasn't the same man who had yielded the crown to Brian all those years ago. The Battle of Clontarf had been a Pyrrhic victory of the most brutal kind. Yes, the Irish forces had won. The Viking threat had been broken, probably forever, but the cost had been catastrophic. Brian was dead, killed in his tent after the battle by fleeing Viking warriors. His son Murchad was dead, cut down in the fighting. Many of the other great Irish kings who had supported Brian were also gone, their armies devastated by the fierce combat. When Máel Sechnaill reclaimed the high kingship, he inherited not a unified kingdom, but a power vacuum. The carefully constructed alliances that Brian had built over decades were collapsing. Regional kings who had accepted Brian's authority because of his military strength and political genius saw no reason to defer to an aging Máel Sechnaill, no matter how noble his bloodline or how impressive his past victories. This was the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the end of the age of high kings in Ireland. The old system, where one man could theoretically claim authority over the entire island, was breaking down under the weight of its own contradictions. Ireland was simply too large, too diverse, and too fractured for medieval communication and transportation to maintain real unity. But Máel Sechnaill didn't know he was presiding over the end of an era. He thought he was rebuilding a temporarily damaged kingdom, and he threw himself into the task with all the energy and skill he possessed. The challenges he faced were enormous. The Norse-Irish population of Dublin and other coastal cities weren't going anywhere. They had been in Ireland for over 2 centuries now, long enough to put down deep roots. Many were second- or third-generation residents who spoke Irish as well as Norse, who followed Irish laws and customs alongside their own traditions. They couldn't be expelled or absorbed. They had to be managed as a permanent part of Irish society. This was completely different from the old days when Vikings were simply foreign raiders to be fought or driven off. These Norse-Irish had legitimate claims to their territories, established trade relationships across Europe, and complex family connections with Gaelic nobility. Some had fought alongside Brian at Clontarf, proving their loyalty to Irish kings. Others remained potential threats, maintaining connections to Scandinavia and the broader Viking world. Máel Sechnaill had to navigate this delicate situation, while also dealing with increasingly independent regional kings. The success of Brian's campaigns had created a generation of Irish rulers who had learned to think beyond their traditional boundaries. They had tasted victory against foreign enemies and seen what could be accomplished through military innovation and political ambition. Many of them saw no reason why they couldn't achieve the same kind of success that Brian had enjoyed. The Kingdom of Leinster was asserting its independence. The northern Uí Néill, Máel Sechnaill's own distant cousins, were pursuing their own agenda. Even within Munster, Brian's former kingdom, different factions were competing for dominance. The unity that had seemed so solid under Brian's iron grip was revealing itself to have been more fragile than anyone had realized. What made Máel Sechnaill's situation even more poignant was that he probably understood better than anyone what was happening. He had lived through the entire cycle, the fractured Ireland of his youth, the brief moment of unity under his own early reign, the longer period of Brian's dominance, and now the return to fragmentation. He could see the patterns repeating themselves, but he was powerless to stop them. The Ireland of his final years was changing in ways that went far beyond politics. Trade was expanding, bringing new ideas and influences from across Europe. The church was becoming more organized and more influential in secular affairs. New technologies were arriving, better farming techniques, improved weapons, more sophisticated methods of building and fortification. The old world of warrior kings and cattle raids was giving way to something more complex and more interconnected. Máel Sechnaill adapted as best he could. He negotiated with the Norse-Irish communities, recognizing their rights while trying to maintain overall Gaelic control. He formed alliances with some regional kings while working to contain others. He patronized the church and supported trade, understanding that Ireland's future lay in becoming part of the broader European world rather than remaining isolated. But he was fighting against historical forces larger than any individual could control. The age of the High Kings was ending not because of any personal failure, but because the system itself was becoming obsolete. Medieval Ireland was growing too complex, too diverse, and too connected to the outside world to be ruled by a single warrior king, no matter how capable. There's something deeply moving about Máel Sechnaill's final years. Here was a man who had achieved everything a medieval Irish king could hope for: military glory, political power, the respect of his enemies, and the loyalty of his followers. He had defeated the Vikings, claimed the high kingship, and ruled over the most powerful kingdom in Ireland. But he was also witnessing the end of the world he had been born to rule. When he died on the 2nd of September, 1022 after Christ, more than just a king passed away. The Uí Néill dynasty that had provided high kings for centuries was finally exhausted. The ancient system that connected Irish kingship to sacred sites like Tara and to bloodlines stretching back into legend was broken beyond repair. The chroniclers of the time seemed to understand the significance of the moment. They wrote about Máel Sechnaill not just as another dead king, but as the end of something important and irreplaceable. He was, they said, the last of the true High Kings, the final link to Ireland's heroic age. In many ways, they were right. The kings who came after Máel Sechnaill would be different creatures, more localized, more practical, less connected to the ancient traditions that had shaped Gaelic Ireland for centuries. They would rule in a world where Norman knights were already eyeing Ireland from across the sea, where the church was becoming an international organization, where trade and diplomacy mattered as much as military prowess. Máel Sechnaill had been born into a world where a king's greatest achievement was to win glory in battle and to be remembered in song. He died in a world where kings needed to be administrators, diplomats, and businessmen, as well as warriors. He had bridged those two worlds as well as anyone could, but the bridge itself was crumbling beneath his feet. His legacy wasn't just in the battles he won or the territories he controlled. It was in the very fact that he had managed to hold together the ancient ideal of Irish kingship, even as everything around it was changing. He had been Ireland's last connection to its mythic past, and when he died, that connection was finally severed forever. The age of heroes was over. The age of politics in all its messy complexity was about to begin. When we look back at the life of Máel Sechnaill mac Domnaill, we're not just seeing the story of one remarkable king. We're witnessing the end of an entire way of life. His 73 years on earth spanned one of the most crucial periods in Irish history, a time when the ancient Gaelic world was giving way to something entirely new. Think about everything this man experienced in his lifetime. He was born into a fractured Ireland where Viking raiders terrorized the coasts, and petty kings squabbled endlessly over cattle and territory. He lived to see that same Ireland briefly united under his own rule, then under Brian Boru's, and finally fragmenting again into the complex medieval kingdom that would soon face Norman invasion. In a single lifetime, he watched his world transform completely. But what makes Máel Sechnaill's story so compelling isn't just the dramatic events he lived through, it's how he navigated them. This was a man who understood that true leadership often means making impossible choices with incomplete information. When he stood on the battlefield at Tara, facing Olaf Cuaran's shield wall, he was betting everything on a single moment. When he yielded the high kingship to Brian Boru, he was choosing long-term survival over short-term pride. When he reclaimed the crown after Brian's death, he was accepting responsibility for a kingdom he knew was already slipping away. These weren't easy decisions. They were the kind of choices that keep kings awake at night, wondering if they're leading their people toward glory or disaster. Máel Sechnaill had to live with the consequences of every choice he made, knowing that thousands of lives hung in the balance. What's remarkable is how often he got it right. His victory at Tara wasn't just a military triumph. It was a moment that changed how every Irish king thought about what was possible. For the first time in generations, someone had proven that Viking power could be broken, that Gaelic Ireland could fight back and win. That psychological victory was almost as important as the territorial gains. His decision to yield to Brian Boru, which must have been one of the most painful moments of his life, probably saved Ireland from a catastrophic civil war. Instead of two great kings destroying each other while foreign enemies watched and waited, Ireland got 12 years of relative unity under Brian's rule. Those were crucial years that allowed the Irish kingdoms to consolidate their strength and prepare for future challenges. And his final reign, after Brian's death, was a masterclass in managing decline gracefully. He couldn't stop the fragmentation that was tearing Ireland apart, but he could ease the transition and preserve what was worth preserving. He became a bridge between the old world and the new, helping his people adapt to changes that were inevitable but not necessarily destructive. There's a lesson here that goes far beyond medieval Irish politics. Máel Sechnaill's life teaches us that leadership isn't always about charging forward and conquering everything in your path. Sometimes the greatest leaders are the ones who know when to step back, when to compromise, when to accept that the world is changing faster than any individual can control. He understood something that many powerful people struggle with, that holding on to power for its own sake is ultimately self-defeating. When he yielded to Brian, he wasn't just giving up a crown. He was choosing the welfare of his people over his own ambitions. That's the kind of decision that separates true leaders from mere politicians. But perhaps most importantly, Máel Sechnaill story reminds us that legacy isn't just about winning battles or accumulating power. It's about the values you embody and the example you set for future generations. He was remembered not just as a great warrior, but as a wise king who understood that strength and wisdom sometimes require completely different responses to the same situation. The chroniclers who wrote about his death understood this. They didn't just record that another king had died. They mourned the passing of an entire way of life. Máel Sechnaill represented something that was disappearing from the world, a connection to ancient traditions and timeless values that were being swept away by the forces of change. In our own time, when the pace of change seems to accelerate every year, there's something comforting about Máel Sechnaill's example. He lived through transformations that were just as dramatic and disorienting as anything we face today. He saw his entire world turned upside down, not once, but repeatedly. And yet he found ways to adapt, to lead, and to preserve what mattered most. His story also reminds us that every age thinks it's living through the end of the world. The people of 11th century Ireland probably felt like their civilization was collapsing around them. The old certainties were gone, foreign influences were everywhere, and the future looked uncertain and dangerous. Sound familiar? But what actually happened was transformation, not destruction. Ireland didn't end when the age of high kings passed away. It became something different, something that could survive and thrive in a more complex world. The Gaelic culture that Máel Sechnaill fought to preserve didn't disappear. It evolved and adapted, finding new forms of expression that could coexist with changing political realities. That's perhaps the most important lesson from his life. Change is inevitable, but it doesn't have to mean the loss of everything we value. Good leaders, like Máel Sechnaill, understand how to guide their people through periods of transformation without losing sight of what makes them who they are. When we remember Máel Sechnaill mac Domnaill today, we're not just honoring a medieval Irish king. We're celebrating the kind of leadership that transcends any particular time or place, the courage to fight when fighting is necessary, the wisdom to yield when yielding serves a greater good, and the vision to see beyond immediate circumstances to longer-term possibilities. His life spanned the end of one world and the beginning of another. That he managed to navigate that transition with honor and effectiveness is a testament not just to his own abilities, but to the enduring human capacity to adapt, survive, and even flourish in the face of overwhelming change. In the end, Máel Sechnaill Mór achieved something more lasting than any military victory or political triumph. He showed us what it means to lead with both strength and wisdom, to fight for what matters while accepting what cannot be changed, and to leave behind a legacy that inspires people centuries later. That's the mark of a truly great leader. Not just someone who wins battles, but someone who helps their people become stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Máel Sechnaill did that for Ireland, and his example continues to do it for us today.